overall, and when we're talking about individuals with intellectual disability, their skills are going to be delayed more than they're going to be different. They're going to eventually maybe learn most of the same things. It's just going to be at a much slower rate. But that being said, overall, there's a great variation in skills, not just between disability categories, but even among the same. So the two kids with Down syndrome might not have the exact same skills because there are other factors that vary into their language. So overall, though, it's important to remember they're just delayed. Some factors that are related to language and communication impairments. It's not possible to say with absolute certainty what causes language and communication impairments in these populations, aside from those things I was talking about, like physical contributions, like if they have a cleft palate or a low tongue tone, protruding tongue, that kind of thing. But we can talk about what contributes to them. So there's a difference there, not what causes them, because we can't say for certain that, but what contributes to them. And that would be things like cognitive delays, physical characteristics, and underlying causes. So cognitive functioning, their defining feature, as that's the first criteria, is that low IQ does not equal low functioning across the board. And that's what I was talking about. They can have a low IQ, but high adaptive skills. Memory strengths, they have long-term memory, good long-term memory to remember, you promised to take them bowling. They might have a really weak weakness in short-term memory, which is what you really need for language learning. So that contributes to their different language or their delayed language. And they might have some attention differences, and that's typically more so with males, like most disabilities. There's seen more often with males, and it happens more in individuals with Fragile X. Specific language disorders that might be prevalent among this population, it's because there's a correlation between intellectual disability and impaired cognitive functioning, like I was just mentioning. So does that mean that a cognitive impairment causes a language disability? Or would you say this last one, that the language impairment causes a delay in cognition because you can't learn as much if you don't have the language to learn it? We're going to look at that. We have to look at children, at the language of these kids with ID compared to their non-disabled children who are matched for the same nonverbal age. So in developmental samples, the performance of a person is often expressed relative to a large sample of typically developing children. So in this case, we're looking at a nonverbal measure. If their language performance is similar, then their language development is dependent on cognitive development. If language development is less advanced, then individuals with ID have some kind of specific language disorder that is not explained by their cognitive development. So like if you take away the language component and they are the same, we assume that the deficit is because of cognition. Or if not, we assume that the cognitive deficit is because of the language difference. This is kind of getting into the mud a little bit. You won't ever be solely responsible for figuring those things out. But I just want you to be thinking, like, what is the correlation? It's kind of like which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Like when we're talking about what's first, thought or language. They're saying, so do you think it's this intellectual disability that causes the language impairment? Or is the language impairment contributing to a more significant cognitive disability? I think when you're talking about genetic conditions like we have been, that's very different. But some of those other ones that happen maybe after birth, it makes you wonder. I think they probably affect each other. I don't know that you can totally separate. And with that being said, all the research is inconsistent. Why don't you know? Most research indicates language development is similar to children that's matched for their mental age, meaning that it is related to cognition, because wherever the child is cognitively, that's the same age they are. This suggests that children with Down syndrome and other ID may have an SLD that's going beyond their cognitive impairment, meaning that it can't just be cognition that's contributing to it, because these kids have language issues beyond their cognitive abilities. Bottom line, for each kid, we have these disability categories and we have these targeted interventions that you'll learn, but you got to look at each kid different. No two kids are the same, even if they look the same on paper. So you got to focus on identifying these specific patterns of language and or communication difficulties for each child. And it might not be able to be assumed just based on their eval or their diagnosis, right? And we have to dig a little deeper. Looking at parent-child interaction, this is just an interesting blip I wanted to put in here, because there was definitely a time, we'll talk about this with autism, where the thinking was that parents were somehow responsible for disabilities, like not just genetically, but like if some kind of parenting style would lead to a disability. Now, if there's neglect and abuse, that's different. That can definitely lead to disadvantages academically, but just like this idea that a parent that's really trying has done something wrong is like way outside of those extremes, but they just parented wrong and that gave their kid a disability. And that's just, on top of already learning and growing and dealing with a child with a disability, can you imagine if someone just thought it was because of your parenting style and you were doing everything in your power to help your child? I think that would be devastating. Anyway, there's been research on it. There's research on parents with intellectual disabilities, and do they actually provide the same language environment? Like, are they the reason that their kid's language is different? Is because they modify their language somehow because their child's disabled? Overall, it shows that they have a similar amount of language. They have similar speech acts. They respond similarly when their child is attempting to communicate. And they might even respond more to a broader range of behaviors because that is how their child is used to communicating. And so they might talk more and respond more, give more direction, more language. So what does this mean about our thoughts on language development? If we're saying that they have a similar environment, and we talked about a few chapters ago how much the environment contributes to language. Well, apparently cognition does have something to do with it because their language environment is the same, but their language is delayed. See what I'm saying? As soon as you think one way, you'll hear something else and you'll think the other way. And again, I just think we pay attention to both their cognitive ability and limitations and their language. One note on this is that actually what happens, and you'll see this, is that with really any disability, but their parents, I believe most of the time, unintentionally overcompensate, and so probably accidentally speak too much to them instead of letting them try and figure it out. And it's, you can't fault them for that. I'm sure I do that with my own kids. There's something inside of you that it's just really hard to watch your child struggle. I thought it was hard to watch my students struggle, but when it's your own kid, it's hard. And so I think that's a temptation, and that's actually a finding, is that these environments are incredibly language rich, maybe too much. So looking at literacy, and this is definitely an area for you. You can teach these kids to read that have ID. When I was talking earlier about what are some contributions, what are some changes overall, and we were talking about No Child Left Behind and some changes about inclusion, this is where this comes in. So when the Individual with Disabilities Education Act was updated in 2004, they said they have to access the general curriculum, they need to be involved in it, and they need to progress in it. And then research, and as recent as 2010, has shown that it works. So this is when they're saying They don't want them to be totally secluded because even with disabilities, they can make progress in regular ed, and that would be a less restrictive environment, and that's what we want to see happen. So I think before there is this thinking, kind of like I was talking about just like put them in a classroom and just get through the day. We don't have very high expectations for them. I think that's changed. And so even in reading, it used to be more like, okay, they probably can't learn to read, but we'll teach them some functional things like the word exit so they know where the exit is if they were in danger. I mean, some really functional things, and not that those things aren't bad, but kids might be able to do more. So there's been this push, like we're still going to try and teach phonological stuff, awareness and processing. We're going to try and teach comprehension. And we need to make a rich literacy environment. It's not just something we assume they can't do. It's definitely something that we push, and we want them to see it in their regular classroom, and we want them to see it in the resource room. That's a big change overall in this area of ID and reading literacy. So again, in summary, they can develop literacy skills. It's probably going to be slower, and it might not reach the same level as their same age peers. They can do more than memorize those sight words. Now, are those functional words still important? Yes. They need to know where the exit is. They need to know those safety things, but you just understand they can do more than that. If research has shown that, then that's not going to be enough for you to do with them. And the most damaging thing you do for them and their life outcomes is just to hold them back because you've assumed something. So remember, you're little scientists. You're going to be constantly going through the scientific method, and you're going to have a guess, and you're going to try something, and then you're going to evaluate, did it work or not? But don't let an assumption stop you, and don't let that affect